The dying man's confession pierced the air like a scalpel. In that moment, Dr. Michael Chen realized he was face to face with his mother's killer. Dr. Chen's world tilted on its axis as he stared at the gaunt figure before him. Frank Thompson, 75, lay in the hospital bed, his face a map of wrinkles and regret. The rhythmic beep of the heart monitor seemed to mock the sudden stillness in the room. "I killed her," Thompson wheezed, his rheumy eyes locked onto Chen's. "Your mother." 30 years ago. Chen's hand tightened on his stethoscope, knuckles turning white. The antiseptic smell of the hospital room suddenly felt suffocating. He fought to keep his professional mask in place, but beneath it, a storm of emotions raged. "Mr. Thompson," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper, "are you saying you're responsible for Linda Chen's disappearance in 1994? Thompson nodded weakly, a tear sliding down his sunken cheek. "I never meant. It wasn't supposed to happen like that." Chen's mind reeled. For 3 decades, the mystery of his mother's disappearance had haunted him, shaping every aspect of his life. It had driven him to become a doctor, to save lives as some sort of cosmic penance for the one he couldn't save. And now, in the cruelest twist of fate, her killer lay before him, dependent on his care. "Why?" Chen asked, the single word laden with 30 years of pain and unanswered questions. Thompson coughed, a rattling sound that seemed to come from the depths of his decaying lungs. "It's complicated. There were powerful people involved. I was just the hired hand, but..." He trailed off, his eyes growing distant. Chen felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sarah Johnson, the night shift nurse, looking at him with concern. "Dr. Chen, are you all right?" she asked, her voice low and steady. He nodded automatically, years of medical training kicking in to maintain his composure. "I'm fine, Sarah. Mr. Thompson needs his pain medication adjusted. Could you take care of that, please?" As Sarah moved to the IV stand, Chen's mind raced. He should call the police, alert his old friend Detective Robert Taylor. This was the break they'd been waiting for all these years. But a darker part of him whispered that justice could be served right here, right now. A miscalculation in dosage, a moment of negligence. Who would question the death of a terminal patient? "Doctor." Thompson's raspy voice cut through Chen's thoughts. "I know I have no right to ask, but I need to tell you everything. Before it's too late." Chen looked at the old man, seeing not just a killer, but a human being grappling with the weight of his sins. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything. "Mr. Thompson," he said, pulling up a chair to the bedside, "I'm listening." As Chen sat down, the weight of his decision settled over him like a heavy cloak. He was a doctor, sworn to preserve life, but he was also a son who had spent decades wondering about his mother's fate. The ethical tightrope he now walked was precarious at best. "Start from the beginning," Chen said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Leave nothing out." Thompson took a shuddering breath, his eyes clouding with memories. It was supposed to be a simple job. Scare her, make her back off. But things went wrong. As Thompson began his tale, Chen felt as if he were being pulled into the past, to a world he had only imagined in his darkest nightmares. The hospital room faded away, replaced by the gritty streets of 1994 Chinatown, where his mother had run a small but popular restaurant. "Your mother, she was a good woman," Thompson continued. "Too good. She wouldn't look the other way when she saw things that powerful people wanted kept quiet." Chen's mind flashed to memories of his mother, her warm smile, the smell of her cooking, the way she always stood up for what was right. Even as a child, he had sensed her strength, her unwavering moral compass. "What kinds of things?" Chen pressed, leaning forward. Thompson's eyes darted nervously around the room. "Money laundering, mostly. Using restaurants as fronts. But there were whispers of worse things, human trafficking, drugs." "Your mother," she started asking questions, talking to the wrong people. The pieces began to fall into place in Chen's mind. He remembered overhearing hushed conversations between his parents, sensing the tension that had filled their home in the weeks before his mother's disappearance. "Who ordered the hit?" Chen asked, his voice low and dangerous. Thompson shook his head weakly. "I can't. They'll kill me." "They'll kill you. You're dying anyway," Chen said bluntly, surprised at his own coldness. "And I deserve to know the truth." A long moment of silence stretched between them, broken only by the steady beep of the heart monitor. Finally, Thompson spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Councilman Richard Hawthorne." The name hit Chen like a physical blow. Richard Hawthorne, the longtime city councilman known for his tough-on-crime stance and community outreach programs. The man who had attended Chen's high school graduation, offering condolences on his mother's disappearance and promising to keep the investigation alive. "Hawthorne?" Chen repeated, disbelief coloring his tone. "But he's a monster in a suit," Thompson finished. "He's built his empire on blood money and broken lives. Your mother, she was going to expose everything." Chen stood abruptly, his head spinning. He needed air, needed to process this information. But as he turned to leave, Thompson's bony hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with surprising strength. "There's more," the old man wheezed. "Things you need to know. About that night. About what really happened to your mother." Chen froze, torn between the desperate need to know and the fear of what he might learn. In that moment of hesitation, the door to the hospital room burst open. Detective Robert Taylor strode in, his face a mask of barely contained excitement. "Mike, we got a break in your mom's case. You're not going to believe." He trailed off as he took in the scene before him. Chen's pale face, Thompson's desperate grip on the doctor's arm. "What's going on here?" Taylor asked, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. Chen looked between his old friend and the dying man who held the key to his past. In that moment, he realized that the truth he had sought for so long was finally within reach, but at what cost? "Rob," Chen said slowly, "you're going to want to sit down for this." As Detective Taylor pulled up a chair, his eyes darting between Chen and Thompson, the atmosphere in the room grew thick with tension. Chen could feel the weight of decades of unanswered questions pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under their burden. "Mr. Thompson here was just about to tell me what really happened to my mother," Chen said, his voice surprisingly calm despite the turmoil raging inside him. Taylor's eyes widened in shock. "You're saying he's involved?" Thompson nodded weakly, his grip on Chen's arm loosening. "I was there that night. I'm the one who took her." The detective's hand moved to his gun again, but Chen held up a hand to stop him. "Let him finish, Rob. We need to hear everything." Taking a deep breath, Thompson continued his tale. "It was raining that night. I remember because the streets were slick, making everything more difficult. We waited until she closed up the restaurant. She always stayed late, counting the day's earnings, planning for the next day." Chen closed his eyes, picturing his mother in her small office at the back of the restaurant. How many times had he sat there as a child, watching her work, admiring her dedication? "We approached her as she was locking up," Thompson went on, his voice growing weaker. "Told her we had a message from Councilman Hawthorne. She knew immediately something was wrong. Tried to run." The old man's face contorted with the effort of speaking, and Chen found himself reaching for the morphine drip, increasing the dose slightly. Part of him wondered if he was doing it out of compassion or a desperate need to keep Thompson lucid long enough to finish his story. "What happened next?" Taylor pressed, leaning forward in his chair. Thompson's eyes grew distant, lost in the memory. "She fought like hell, scratched me good, still have the scar." He gestured weakly to his neck, where a faint white line was barely visible. "But there were 3 of us. We overpowered her, got her into the van." Chen felt his fists clench involuntarily, imagining his mother's terror, her desperate struggle. "Where did you take her?" "An old warehouse by the docks." Hawthorne was waiting. Thompson's voice dropped to a whisper. He tried to reason with her at first. Offered her money, protection. Said he could make her restaurant the most successful in the city if she just kept her mouth shut. But she refused, Chen said, knowing in his heart that his mother would never have compromised her principles. Thompson nodded. She spat in his face. Told him she'd see him rot in prison before she'd take his blood money. That's when things got ugly. The room fell silent, the weight of what was left unsaid hanging heavy in the air. Chen found himself holding his breath, dreading what would come next but knowing he had to hear it. Hawthorne lost it, Thompson continued, his voice barely audible now. Started hitting her, screaming about how he'd built this city, how no one was going to take it away from him. We tried to pull him off, but he was like a man possessed. Chen felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to see Sarah, the nurse, standing behind him. Her face was pale, eyes wide with shock at what she was overhearing. He had almost forgotten she was in the room. When it was over, Thompson said, a tear rolling down his wrinkled cheek, she wasn't moving. Hawthorne. He ordered us to get rid of the body. Make sure it was never found. Where? Taylor demanded, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. Where did you take her? Thompson shook his head weakly. I can't. I don't remember exactly. It was an old construction site, I think. They were laying the foundation for a new building. We put her in the concrete. Chen felt the room spin around him. All these years, his mother had been buried beneath the very city she had tried to protect. He stumbled backwards, bumping into the medical equipment. Mike, Taylor said, reaching out to steady his friend. I'm so sorry. We'll find her. We'll make this right. But Chen barely heard him. His eyes were locked on Thompson, who lay gasping for breath, the effort of his confession clearly taking its toll. Why now? Chen asked, his voice hollow. Why tell us this after all these years? Thompson's eyes met his, filled with a mixture of regret and something that might have been hope. Because I'm dying, doctor. And I couldn't go without trying to make amends. Your mother, she deserved better. You deserve to know the truth. Chen felt a storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him, grief, rage, a perverse sense of gratitude towards this dying murderer. But above all, he felt a steely resolve settling over him. Thank you, he said quietly to Thompson. Then, turning to Taylor, we need to move fast. If Hawthorne gets wind of this. The detective nodded grimly. I'll call it in. Get a team together. We'll need to keep this quiet until we can build a solid case. As Taylor stepped out of the room to make his calls, Chen found himself alone with Thompson once more. The old man's breathing had grown labored, his skin taking on a grayish pallor. Doctor, Thompson wheezed, I know I have no right to ask, but can you forgive me? Chen looked at the dying man, the instrument of his mother's death, and felt the weight of 30 years of pain and uncertainty. In that moment, he made a decision that would shape the rest of his life. I don't know if I can forgive you, he said honestly. But I'm grateful for the truth. And I'll make sure you're comfortable, until the end. Thompson nodded weakly, closing his eyes. As Chen adjusted the morphine drip one last time, he felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The truth had finally come to light, and with it, the chance for justice, and perhaps, someday, healing. As he stepped out of the room, Chen knew that his life would never be the same. The road ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger and uncertainty. But for the first time in 30 years, he felt like he could finally move forward, armed with the truth and determined to honor his mother's memory. The hunt for Councilman Hawthorne and the search for his mother's remains would begin tomorrow. But for now, Dr. Michael Chen had patients to attend to, and a long-delayed grieving process to begin. As the night wore on, Dr. Michael Chen found himself moving through the hospital corridors in a daze. The weight of Thompson's confession pressed down on him, making each step feel like he was wading through quicksand. The familiar sights and sounds of the hospital, the squeak of gurney wheels, the hushed conversations of nurses changing shifts, the monotonous beep of vital sign monitors, all seemed distant and muffled, as if he were experiencing them from underwater. He made his rounds mechanically, checking on patients, adjusting medications, and scribbling notes in charts. But his mind was elsewhere, replaying Thompson's words over and over again. The image of his mother, trapped and terrified in that warehouse, fighting for her life against men like Thompson, haunted him. And looming over it all was the shadowy figure of Councilman Richard Hawthorne, a man Chen had respected, even admired, for years. As he finished checking on his last patient of the night, Chen found himself drawn to the hospital's small chapel. He wasn't a religious man. His faith had been one of the many casualties of his mother's disappearance, but he needed a quiet place to think, to try and make sense of the whirlwind of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. The chapel was empty at this late hour, lit only by the soft glow of electric candles. Chen sank into a pew near the back, his head in his hands. For the first time since Thompson's confession, he allowed himself to truly feel the magnitude of what had happened. A sob escaped his throat, raw and primal. Years of pent-up grief, anger, and confusion poured out of him in waves. He wept for his mother, for the life she'd lost, for the years of not knowing. He wept for his father, who had died never knowing the truth about his wife's fate. And he wept for himself, for the boy he'd been and the man he'd become, shaped by this unresolved tragedy. Mike, a soft voice called from the chapel entrance. Chen looked up to see Sarah Johnson, the night nurse, standing there with concern etched on her face. I thought I might find you here. Chen hastily wiped his eyes, embarrassed to be caught in such a vulnerable state. Sarah, I'm sorry. I just needed a moment. She moved to sit beside him, her presence comforting in its familiarity. Don't apologize. After what you learned tonight, I can't even imagine what you're going through. For a long moment, they sat in silence. Chen was grateful for Sarah's quiet support. They'd worked together for years, developing the kind of shorthand and mutual understanding that often forms between colleagues in high-stress environments. But this was different. This was Sarah seeing him not as Dr. Chen, the competent surgeon, but as Mike, the man grappling with a profound personal crisis. I don't know what to do, Chen admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. All these years, I've imagined finding out what happened to my mother. But now that I know, I feel lost. Sarah placed a gentle hand on his arm. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Mike. What you learned, it's huge. It's going to take time to process. Chen nodded, grateful for her words but still feeling adrift. It's not just about my mother anymore. Hawthorne. If what Thompson said is true, he's been corrupting this city for decades. How many other families have suffered because of him? How many other victims are out there? That's not on you, Sarah said firmly. You can't carry the weight of all that. But even as she spoke, Chen felt a sense of purpose beginning to crystallize within him. Maybe not, but I can do something about it now. I have to. Sarah studied him for a moment, concern clear in her eyes. Just promise me you'll be careful. If Hawthorne is as dangerous as Thompson said. I will, Chen assured her, though a part of him wondered if he could keep that promise. The need for justice, for his mother, for all of Hawthorne's victims, burned within him like a fever. As they left the chapel together, Chen felt a mix of emotions churning inside him. The grief and shock were still there, raw and painful. But alongside them was a newfound determination. He would see this through, no matter the cost. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Detective Taylor moved quickly, assembling a small, trusted team to investigate Thompson's claims. Chen found himself pulled into marathon meetings with lawyers, forensic experts, and cold case specialists. Every free moment was spent poring over old case files, news reports, and city records, searching for any corroborating evidence. Through it all, Chen struggled to maintain his normal routine at the hospital. He threw himself into his work with renewed vigor, as if saving lives in the present could somehow atone for his inability to save his mother in the past. His colleagues noticed the change in him, the dark circles under his eyes, the intense focus that bordered on obsession, but chalked it up to the stress of a difficult case. It was nearly a week after Thompson's confession when Chen received an urgent call from Taylor. We've got something, the detective said, his voice tight with excitement. Meet me at the old Bayside construction site in an hour. Chen's heart raced as he made his way to the location. The construction site was on the outskirts of town, a sprawling complex of half-finished buildings and piles of raw materials. Taylor was waiting for him at the entrance, along with a team of forensic specialists and several uniformed officers. What did you find? Chen asked, barely able to contain his impatience. Taylor led him to a cordoned-off area where workers were carefully excavating a section of old foundation. We cross-referenced Thompson's statement with city records from '94. This building was under construction at the time your mother disappeared. The timeline fits. Chen stared at the scene before him, his mind reeling. Could his mother really have been here all this time, buried beneath layers of concrete and steel? The thought made him feel sick. Dr. Chen? One of the forensic specialists approached, her expression grim. We've uncovered some bone fragments. We'll need to run tests to confirm, but it's her, Chen said, a certainty settling over him like a heavy blanket. I know it is. As the team worked to carefully exhume the remains, Chen stood watch, a silent sentinel. He thought about his mother, her warmth, her strength, her unwavering sense of right and wrong. He thought about the life she'd lost, the years stolen from her. And he thought about Hawthorne, the man responsible for all of this pain. We'll get him, Mike, Taylor said, placing a hand on Chen's shoulder. With this evidence, and Thompson's statement, Hawthorne's going down. Chen nodded, but a part of him wondered if justice through the legal system would be enough. The anger that had been simmering inside him since Thompson's confession threatened to boil over. He wanted Hawthorne to suffer, to feel the same fear and pain that his mother had felt in her final moments. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the construction site, Chen made a silent vow. He would see this through to the end, whatever it took. For his mother, for all of Hawthorne's victims, and for the city that had been corrupted for far too long. But even as he steeled himself for the fight ahead, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. In his quest for justice, how far was he willing to go? And at what cost to his own soul? As the forensic team worked meticulously to recover the remains, Chen felt a surreal detachment wash over him. The cool evening air, the floodlights illuminating the excavation site, the hushed voices of the investigators. It all seemed like a scene from a movie, not his real life. Yet here he was, watching as strangers unearthed his mother's bones from their concrete tomb. Dr. Chen, a gentle voice broke through his reverie. It was Dr. Emily Martinez, the chief of surgery and Chen's mentor. Her presence at the site was unexpected, and Chen felt a mixture of gratitude and unease at her arrival. Emily, he managed, his voice hoarse. What are you doing here? She stepped closer, her eyes filled with concern. Detective Taylor called me. He thought you might need support. Chen nodded, unable to form words. Emily had been more than just a boss to him over the years. She had taken him under her wing when he was a young, driven resident, recognizing in him a kindred spirit, someone who used their work as a shield against personal pain. Mike, Emily said softly, using his first name, a rarity for her. I can't imagine what you're going through right now. But I want you to know that you're not alone in this. Her words, meant to comfort, instead caused something to crack inside Chen. The protective numbness he'd been clinging to since arriving at the site began to dissolve. She's been here all along, he choked out, gesturing towards the excavation. All these years, while I was growing up, going to school, becoming a doctor, she was here. Alone. Forgotten. Emily placed a steadying hand on his arm. Not forgotten, Mike. Never forgotten. You've carried her memory with you every day. And now, you're bringing her home. Chen closed his eyes, fighting back tears. When he opened them again, his gaze was steely with resolve. This is just the beginning, he said. Hawthorne has to pay for what he's done. Emily's expression grew troubled. Mike, I understand your need for justice. But promise me you won't do anything rash. Your mother wouldn't want you to throw away everything you've worked for. Before Chen could respond, Detective Taylor approached, his face grim. We've got a positive ID on the remains, he said quietly. It's her, Mike. I'm so sorry. The confirmation, though expected, hit Chen like a physical blow. He swayed on his feet, steadied by Emily's grip on his arm. What happens now? Chen asked, his voice sounding distant to his own ears. Taylor sighed heavily. We build our case. Thompson's confession, the physical evidence here. It's strong, but Hawthorne has deep pockets and a lot of influence. This won't be easy. Chen nodded, a plan already forming in his mind. I want to be involved. Every step of the way. Mike, Emily interjected, her tone cautionary. You need to be careful. You're too close to this. I'm already involved, Chen said firmly. This is my mother we're talking about. I need to see this through. Taylor and Emily exchanged worried glances, but neither argued further. They recognized the determination in Chen's eyes, the same look he got before a particularly challenging surgery. As the night wore on and the recovery process continued, Chen found himself replaying memories of his mother. Her laugh, the smell of her perfume, the way she'd ruffle his hair when he made her proud. Each memory was bittersweet, tainted now by the knowledge of her violent end. But alongside the grief, a fierce anger began to burn. Hawthorne had taken all of this from him, from his family, from the community his mother had sought to protect. The councilman's decades of corruption and violence needed to end. In the days that followed, Chen threw himself into the investigation with a fervor that worried his colleagues. He took a leave of absence from the hospital, much to Emily's concern, and spent long hours with Taylor and his team, poring over evidence and helping to build the case against Hawthorne. The councilman, for his part, maintained his innocence publicly. He expressed shock at the allegations and offered his condolences to Chen, playing the role of the concerned public servant to perfection. But behind the scenes, His legal team was working overtime to discredit Thompson's confession and suppress evidence. It was during one late-night strategy session with Taylor that Chen first broached the idea that had been growing in his mind. "What if we could get Hawthorne to confess?" he asked, interrupting Taylor's rundown of potential witnesses. The detective looked at him skeptically. "And how exactly do you propose we do that? The man's a seasoned politician. He's not going to crack under normal interrogation." Chen leaned forward, his eyes intense. What if it wasn't a normal interrogation? What if he thought he was dying? Taylor's eyebrows shot up. "What are you suggesting, Mike?" "A medical emergency," Chen said, the words tumbling out as he gave voice to the plan he'd been formulating. Something that would make him think he only had minutes to live. In that moment, faced with his own mortality, he might want to clear his conscience, Taylor finished, a mix of admiration and unease in his voice. "It's a hell of a risky play, Mike. And ethically." "Ethics?" Chen scoffed bitterly. "Where were ethics when he ordered my mother's murder? When he spent decades corrupting this city?" Taylor held up his hands placatingly. "I get it, believe me. But we have to be careful. If we cross certain lines, the whole case could fall apart. And Hawthorne walks free." Chen nodded reluctantly, recognizing the truth in Taylor's words. But the seed of the idea had been planted, and he couldn't shake it. If the legal system failed, if Hawthorne's money and influence allowed him to escape justice, Chen wasn't sure he could live with that. As he left the police station that night, Chen's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. The righteous anger that had been driving him warred with the ethical principles he'd sworn to uphold as a doctor. He thought of his mother, of her unwavering moral compass. What would she want him to do? Lost in thought, Chen almost didn't notice the black SUV that pulled up beside him as he walked to his car. The rear window rolled down, revealing a face he recognized immediately, Richard Hawthorne. "Dr. Chen," the councilman called out, his voice smooth and controlled. "I was hoping we might have a word." Chen felt his heart rate spike, adrenaline flooding his system. This was the man responsible for his mother's death, sitting mere feet away. "I don't think we have anything to discuss, Councilman," Chen replied, struggling to keep his voice steady. Hawthorne's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I think we do, Doctor. For both our sakes, I suggest you get in the car. We have much to talk about." As Chen hesitated, torn between fury and caution, he saw the subtle bulge of a weapon beneath the jacket of the man in the passenger seat. The threat was clear. Taking a deep breath, Chen made his decision. He opened the car door and slid into the backseat next to Hawthorne. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, Chen realized he was crossing a threshold. Whatever happened next would change everything. The city lights blurred outside the tinted windows as the SUV wound its way through the nighttime streets. Chen sat rigid, hyper-aware of every movement, every sound. Beside him, Hawthorne exuded an aura of calm control that only fueled Chen's anger. "I want to express my deepest condolences, Drive. Chen," Hawthorne began, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "The loss of a parent is always difficult, but to have it happen in such a tragic way. Spare me your condolences," Chen snapped, unable to contain himself. "We both know why I'm here." Hawthorne's facade slipped for just a moment, a flicker of something cold and dangerous passing across his features. "Indeed," he said, his tone hardening. "Let's dispense with the pleasantries, then. You've become quite a thorn in my side, Doctor." Chen met the councilman's gaze unflinchingly. "Good. You deserve far worse for what you've done." A humorless chuckle escaped Hawthorne's lips. "What I've done? I've built this city, Drive. Chen. I've created jobs, revitalized neighborhoods, kept the streets safe. A few necessary sacrifices along the way don't negate all the good I've accomplished." The casual way Hawthorne dismissed his mother's murder as a necessary sacrifice made Chen's blood boil. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out physically. "You're a monster," Chen growled. "And you're going to pay for your crimes." Hawthorne leaned back, studying Chen with a mixture of amusement and calculation. "Am I? You seem very confident, Doctor. But let me assure you, men far more powerful than you have tried to bring me down." They all failed. The SUV came to a stop, and Chen realized they had arrived at the waterfront. The driver and the man in the passenger seat exited the vehicle, leaving Chen alone with Hawthorne. I brought you here to offer you a chance, Hawthorne said, his tone businesslike. Walk away from this crusade of yours. Go back to your life, your career. I'm willing to be generous in exchange for your cooperation. Chen stared at the councilman in disbelief. You think you can buy me off? After what you did to my mother? Hawthorne sighed, as if disappointed by Chen's response. I had hoped you would be reasonable. Your mother, for all her misguided principles, was an intelligent woman. I expected her son to show similar pragmatism. Don't you dare speak about her, Chen snarled, his control slipping. A cold smile played at the corners of Hawthorne's mouth. Or what, doctor? What exactly do you think you can do to me? In that moment, as Chen looked into Hawthorne's eyes and saw the utter lack of remorse, something snapped inside him. All the grief, anger, and frustration of the past weeks coalesced into a single, burning desire for justice, or was it vengeance? Without fully realizing what he was doing, Chen's hand shot out, grabbing Hawthorne by the throat. The councilman's eyes widened in surprise and fear as Chen applied pressure, cutting off his air supply. I could end you right here, Chen hissed, his voice barely recognizable to his own ears. It would be so easy. Hawthorne clawed at Chen's hand, panic replacing his usual composure. For a long, terrible moment, Chen teetered on the edge of an abyss. He could feel Hawthorne's pulse racing beneath his fingers, could see the fear in the man's eyes. It would be so simple to just squeeze. To end the life of the man who had caused so much pain and suffering. To avenge his mother and all of Hawthorne's other victims. But as he stared into Hawthorne's terrified face, Chen saw something else. A reflection of himself, twisted by rage and grief into something he barely recognized. This wasn't justice. This was murder. With a shuddering breath, Chen released his grip. Hawthorne gasped for air, coughing and sputtering. You're going to face justice, Chen said, his voice shaking but resolute. Not like this, but in a courtroom, where everyone will know what you've done. Before Hawthorne could respond, the car doors opened. Chen half expected Hawthorne's men to grab him, to make him disappear like they had done to his mother all those years ago. Instead, he heard a familiar voice, NYPD. Hands where we can see them. Detective Taylor and a team of officers swarmed the SUV, weapons drawn. In the chaos that followed, as Hawthorne was pulled from the vehicle and cuffed, Chen sat in stunned silence. Taylor appeared at the car door, concern etched on his face. You okay, Mike? We've been tailing you since you left the station. When we saw you get in the car with Hawthorne. Chen nodded numbly, the full weight of what had just transpired beginning to settle over him. He had come so close to crossing a line from which there would have been no return. As he watched Hawthorne being led away in handcuffs, shouting about his lawyers and making threats, Chen felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief, exhaustion, a lingering anger, but also peace. For the first time since learning the truth about his mother's fate, he felt like he could breathe again. The fight wasn't over. There would be trials, both in court and in Chen's own conscience. But in choosing justice over vengeance, in honoring his mother's memory rather than tarnishing it with more violence, Chen had taken the first step towards healing. As the first light of dawn began to break over the city skyline, Chen stood on the waterfront, watching the play of colors on the waves. He thought of his mother, of the life she had lived and the principles she had died for. And he made a silent promise, to honor her memory not through vengeance, but by living the kind of life she would have been proud of. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in years, Dr. Michael Chen felt ready to face it. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over the waterfront, Detective Taylor approached Chen. The events of the night had left them both exhausted, but there was a sense of cautious triumph in the air. We've got him, Mike, Taylor said, his voice a mixture of relief and determination. Hawthorne's lawyer is already making noise, but with the evidence we've gathered and now this. He gestured to the scene around them, where officers were still processing Hawthorne's vehicle and cataloging evidence. Chen nodded, still processing the whirlwind of emotions from his confrontation with Hawthorne. What happens now? Taylor ran a hand through his hair, looking every bit as tired as Chen felt. Now, we build our case. It's not going to be easy. Hawthorne has connections, money, influence. He'll fight this every step of the way. I want to help, Chen said firmly. Whatever you need, I'm there. The detective eyed him warily. Mike, I appreciate that, but after what happened tonight, maybe it's best if you take a step back. Let us handle this part. Chen felt a flash of frustration. Rob, this is my mother we're talking about. I can't just sit on the sidelines. I know, Taylor said, his tone softening. But think about it from our perspective. If the defense can paint you as unstable or out for revenge, it could damage the entire case. We need to do this by the book. Deep down, Chen knew Taylor was right. The image of his hands around Hawthorne's throat flashed through his mind, and he shuddered inwardly. How close had he come to throwing everything away? Okay, Chen conceded reluctantly. But keep me in the loop. Please. Taylor nodded, relief evident on his face. Of course. And Mike, take care of yourself. You've been through hell these past few weeks. It's okay to take some time, process everything. As if on cue, Chen's phone buzzed. It was a text from Dr. Martinez. Heard what happened. Come see me when you can. We need to talk. Chen sighed, knowing he couldn't put off facing the consequences of his actions at the hospital any longer. I've got to go, he told Taylor. Keep me posted? The detective clapped him on the shoulder. You got it. And Mike, you did good tonight. Your mom would be proud. The words hit Chen like a physical force, bringing a lump to his throat. He managed a nod before turning away, not trusting himself to speak. The drive to the hospital felt surreal. The city was coming to life around him, people going about their daily routines, unaware of the seismic shifts that had occurred in Chen's world overnight. He felt disconnected from it all, as if he were moving through a dream. Dr. Emily Martinez was waiting for him in her office, her face a mask of concern. As soon as Chen walked in, she stood and enveloped him in a tight hug. The unexpected gesture of support nearly broke him. Oh, Mike, she said softly as she released him. What a night you've had. Chen sank into the chair across from her desk, suddenly feeling the full weight of his exhaustion. Emily, I don't even know where to begin. She sat back down, studying him with the keen eye of both a doctor and a friend. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out. Over the next hour, Chen poured out the whole story. Thompson's confession, the discovery of his mother's remains, the confrontation with Hawthorne. He held nothing back, including his moment of near violence in the SUV. Emily listened without interruption, her expression shifting between sympathy, concern, and, at times, barely concealed anger on his behalf. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. First of all, she said finally, I want you to know how incredibly sorry I am for everything you've been through. What happened to your mother? It's unimaginable. Chen nodded, throat tight with emotion. That said, Emily continued, her tone growing more serious, we need to talk about your future here at the hospital. Chen felt his heart sink. Am I being fired? Emily shook her head quickly. No, nothing like that. But Mike, you've been through a traumatic experience. You came very close to crossing a line last night that could have destroyed your career and your life. I know, Chen admitted, the shame of his actions washing over him anew. I lost control. It won't happen again. I believe you, Emily said gently. But I also believe you need time to process everything that's happened. To grieve, to heal. She leaned forward, her eyes meeting his. I'm putting you on paid leave, effective immediately. Take some time, Mike. See a therapist. Deal with your mother's funeral arrangements. Let yourself feel everything you've been pushing down. Part of Chen wanted to argue, to insist that he was fine, that he could handle his work responsibilities. But a larger part recognized the wisdom in Emily's words. He was running on fumes, emotionally and physically drained. How long? He asked. A month, to start, Emily replied. We'll reassess after that. And Mike, this isn't a punishment. It's about taking care of you, so you can come back to us whole and ready to be the incredible doctor I know you are. Chen felt a rush of gratitude for his mentor's understanding and support. Thank you, Emily. For everything. As he left her office, Chen felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. The prospect of facing his emotions, of dealing with the full impact of everything that had happened, was daunting. But he also recognized it as necessary. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity and emotion. Chen threw himself into helping Taylor and the prosecution team build their case against Hawthorne, providing whatever information and context he could without directly involving himself in the investigation. He also began the painful process of arranging his mother's funeral. As he sorted through old photographs and mementos, choosing which ones to display at the service, Chen found himself overwhelmed by memories. There were moments of laughter and joy, but also a deep, aching sadness for all the years lost. The funeral itself was a small, private affair. Chen was surprised by the number of people from his mother's old neighborhood who came to pay their respects. Many shared stories of her kindness, her strength, her unwavering commitment to doing what was right. Each tale was a bittersweet reminder of the extraordinary woman she had been. As he stood by her grave, watching the casket being lowered into the earth, Chen felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was grief, of course. A bone-deep sorrow for the mother he had lost twice, first to disappearance and then to death. But there was also a sense of closure, of finally being able to say goodbye. In the quiet moments after the other mourners had left, Chen knelt by the fresh grave. "I'm sorry it took so long to bring you home, Mom," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "But I promise you, I'll make this right. I'll make sure Hawthorne pays for what he did, and I'll try to live the kind of life that would make you proud." As the weeks of his leave passed, Chen found himself slowly beginning to heal. Regular sessions with a therapist helped him process his grief and anger in healthier ways. He reconnected with old friends, spent time volunteering at a local community center his mother had supported, and even began to rediscover the joy in simple pleasures like cooking or taking long walks in the park. But always, in the back of his mind, was the upcoming trial. Hawthorne's arrest had sent shockwaves through the city's political establishment. As more evidence came to light, other victims began to come forward, painting a picture of decades of corruption and violence. Chen knew the trial would be difficult. He would have to relive the most painful moments of his life, to face Hawthorne in court and recount the devastating impact of his actions. But he also knew it was necessary, not just for justice for his mother, but for all those who had suffered under Hawthorne's reign of corruption. As his leave neared its end, Chen felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness about returning to work. Had he truly processed everything? Was he ready to face the pressures and ethical dilemmas of his job again? The night before his scheduled return, Chen found himself once again at the hospital chapel. This time, however, the space didn't feel oppressive with grief. Instead, there was a sense of quiet reflection, of coming full circle. As he sat in the dim light, Chen thought about the journey he had been on, from the driven but emotionally closed-off doctor he had been before Thompson's confession, to the man he was now. He had faced his deepest fears, confronted unimaginable truths, and come out the other side not unscathed, but perhaps stronger for it. He thought of his mother, of her courage and her unwavering moral compass. He thought of the patients waiting for him, each with their own stories and struggles. And he thought of the oath he had taken as a doctor, to heal and to do no harm. In that moment, Dr. Michael Chen made a decision. He would return to his work, not running from his past but carrying it with him as a source of strength and purpose. He would honor his mother's memory by living with integrity, by fighting for justice through legal and ethical means, and by using his skills to help others. As he left the chapel and walked through the familiar corridors of the hospital, Chen felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would not be easy. The trial, his return to work, the ongoing process of healing, all would present challenges. But for the first time in a long time, Michael Chen felt ready to face whatever came next. He had found his way back to the path of healing, for himself, for his patients, and for the memory of the mother who had shaped him into the man he was today. As Chen stepped back into the bustling corridors of the hospital for his first shift back, he was immediately struck by a sense of both familiarity and newness. The sights, sounds, and smells were all as he remembered, but he viewed them through a different lens now. Each patient, each colleague, seemed to carry a story he was newly attuned to perceive. Dr. Martinez was waiting for him at the nurse's station, a warm smile on her face. "Welcome back, Mike," she said, handing him a stack of charts. "Ready to jump back in?" Chen nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. "As ready as I'll ever be," he replied, flipping through the files. His first case of the day was a young woman with unexplained abdominal pain. As Chen entered her room, he was struck by the fear in her eyes, a fear he now recognized all too well. "Good morning, Ms. Rodriguez," he said, his voice gentle. "I'm Drive. Chen, can you tell me what's been going on?" As the patient described her symptoms, Chen found himself listening not just with his medical knowledge, but with a new level of empathy. He asked questions not only about her physical symptoms but about her life, her stressors, her support system. By the end of the examination, Chen had not only developed a treatment plan for her medical issues but had also connected her with the hospital's social services to address some underlying concerns she'd mentioned. As he left the room, Chen felt a sense of satisfaction he hadn't experienced in a long time. This was why he'd become a doctor, not just to treat illnesses, but to truly help people. The rest of his shift followed a similar pattern. With each patient, Chen found himself more present, more engaged. He wasn't just going through the motions of diagnosis and treatment, he was connecting with people, seeing the whole person behind the symptoms. As he was finishing up his paperwork at the end of the shift drive, Martinez approached him again. "How did it feel to be back?" she asked, studying his face closely. Chen considered the question carefully. "Different," he admitted, "but in a good way, I think. I feel like I'm seeing things more clearly now." Emily nodded, a look of understanding in her eyes. "Trauma changes us, Mike. But sometimes, if we're lucky, it can also open our eyes to things we couldn't see before." As Chen left the hospital that evening, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. The weight of his mother's loss and the upcoming trial were still there, but they no longer felt like burdens dragging him down. Instead, they had become driving forces, pushing him to be a better doctor, a better person. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. Chen threw himself back into his work with renewed vigor, earning admiring comments from colleagues about his increased empathy and attention to detail. But outside of the hospital, his focus remained on the approaching trial. Detective Taylor kept him updated on the case's progress. The prosecution was building a strong argument, but Hawthorne's defense team was pulling out all the stops to discredit witnesses and suppress evidence. "They're trying to paint Thompson as an unreliable witness due to his terminal condition," Taylor explained during one of their regular meetings. "And they're pushing hard to exclude your mother's remains, arguing that the excavation was improperly handled." Chen felt a surge of anger at the tactics, but he forced himself to remain calm. "What can I do to help?" he asked. Taylor sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Honestly, Mike, the best thing you can do is prepare yourself for your testimony. It's going to be tough. Hawthorne's lawyers are going to come at you hard, try to make you look unstable or out for revenge." Chen nodded, a knot forming in his stomach. He knew his testimony would be crucial, but the thought of facing Hawthorne in court, of having to relive the most painful moments of his life under cross-examination, was daunting. As the trial date approached, Chen found himself spending more time at the community center his mother had supported. Volunteering there gave him a sense of connection to her, a way of honoring her memory that felt more productive than dwelling on his anger or fear. It was during one of these volunteer sessions that Chen met Maria, an elderly woman who had known his mother years ago. As they worked together sorting donations, Maria shared stories that painted a vivid picture of the woman Linda Chen had been. "Your mother, she was not afraid of anyone," Maria said, her eyes twinkling with remembered admiration. "When those thugs tried to shake down old Mr. Lee for protection money, Linda marched right up to them and told them to leave. Said if they came back, she'd make sure the whole neighborhood knew what cowards they were, picking on an old man." Chen listened, enraptured. Each story was like a piece of a puzzle, helping him build a more complete image of his mother. She wasn't just a victim or a martyr, she was a complex, courageous woman who had touched many lives. As the day of the trial finally arrived, Chen found himself drawing strength from these stories. He thought of his mother's bravery as he donned his suit and made his way to the courthouse. The scene outside was chaotic. Reporters swarmed around, shouting questions. Protesters held signs denouncing Hawthorne, while a smaller group of supporters proclaimed his innocence. Chen kept his head down, following Taylor's advice to avoid engaging with anyone before his testimony. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Chen's eyes were immediately drawn to Hawthorne, sitting at the defense table in an expensive suit, looking every inch the respected politician he'd pretended to be for so long. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Chen felt a chill run down his spine at the cold calculation he saw there. As the trial proceeded, Chen listened with a mix of emotions as the prosecution laid out their case. They presented evidence of Hawthorne's decades-long corruption, tying him not just to Linda Chen's murder but to a web of illegal activities that had poisoned the city for years. When it was finally Chen's turn to testify, he took a deep breath, steadying himself. As he took the stand and swore to tell the truth, he felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. This was his chance to speak for his mother, to ensure her story was heard. The prosecutor led him gently through his testimony, asking about his mother, about the impact of her disappearance, about the night Thompson had confessed. Chen spoke clearly and calmly, his voice steady even as he recounted the most painful moments. Then came the cross-examination. Hawthorne's lawyer was aggressive, trying to paint Chen as unstable, obsessed with revenge. He brought up the confrontation in the SUV, suggesting that Chen had attacked his client unprovoked. "Dr. Chen," the lawyer said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "isn't it true that you've been under immense stress lately? That you've had to take a leave of absence from your job due to emotional instability?" Chen felt a flash of anger, but he forced himself to remain calm. He thought of his mother's courage, of the patients he'd helped since returning to work, of the oath he'd taken as a doctor. "I took a leave of absence to process the trauma of learning about my mother's murder," Chen replied evenly. "To ensure that I could return to my work as a doctor with a clear mind and open heart. If anything, this experience has made me more stable, more committed to helping others and seeking justice through legal means." The lawyer pressed on, but Chen held his ground. He spoke of his mother's dedication to the community, of the lives Hawthorne's corruption had destroyed, of the importance of facing the truth no matter how painful. As he stepped down from the witness stand, Chen caught sight of Dr. Martinez in the gallery, giving him an encouraging nod. He felt a wave of gratitude for her support, for everyone who had stood by him through this ordeal. The trial continued for weeks, with a parade of witnesses testifying to Hawthorne's crimes. Chen attended every day, drawing strength from the other victims and their families who shared their stories. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned with their verdict. As the foreman stood to read it, Chen held his breath, feeling the weight of years of pain and struggle in that moment. On the count of first-degree murder in the death of Linda Chen, we find the defendant, Richard Hawthorne, guilty. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and sobs. Chen sat stunned for a moment, barely registering the rest of the verdicts being read out: guilty on charges of corruption, racketeering, obstruction of justice. As Hawthorne was led away in handcuffs, his mask of confidence finally cracking, Chen felt a complex swirl of emotions. There was relief, certainly, and a sense of justice served. But there was also a strange emptiness. The goal he'd been working towards for so long had been achieved, but it couldn't bring his mother back. Outside the courthouse, surrounded by a sea of reporters and well-wishers, Chen found himself at a loss for words. It was Detective Taylor who stepped up, fielding questions and praising the courage of all the victims who had come forward. As the crowd began to disperse, Chen felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Dr. Martinez standing there, a soft smile on her face. "Your mother would be proud, Mike," she said quietly. "Not just of this verdict, but of the man you've become through all of this." Chen nodded, feeling tears prick at his eyes. "Thank you, Emily, for everything." As they walked away from the courthouse together, Chen felt a sense of closure, but also of new beginnings. The fight for justice wasn't over. There were still corrupt systems to be dismantled, still people who needed help and healing. But for the first time in a long time, Dr. Michael Chen felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had honored his mother's memory not just by bringing her killer to justice, but by embodying the principles she had lived by: courage, compassion, and an unwavering commitment to doing what was right. As he looked out over the city he called home, Chen made a silent promise to continue his mother's work, to use his skills as a doctor and his newfound voice as an advocate to make a difference. The road ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to walk it, carrying with him the strength and love of those who had shaped him into the man he had become. As the days following the verdict turned into weeks, Chen found himself navigating a new reality. The intense focus on Hawthorne's trial had consumed so much of his energy and attention that its conclusion left him feeling somewhat adrift. Yet, as he settled back into his routine at the hospital, he discovered a renewed sense of purpose in his work. One morning, as Chen was making his rounds, he encountered a case that would challenge him in unexpected ways. Sarah, a 16-year-old patient, had been admitted with severe abdominal pain and unexplained bruising. As Chen reviewed her chart, he felt a growing sense of unease. "Dr. Chen?" Nurse Johnson approached him, her voice low. There's something you should know about Sarah's case. Her parents are insisting on being present for all examinations, and she seems reluctant to speak when they're around. Chen nodded, his mind already piecing together a troubling picture. Thank you, Nurse Johnson. I'll handle this carefully. As he entered Sarah's room, Chen immediately noticed the tension. Sarah's parents hovered protectively, while the girl herself seemed to shrink into her hospital bed. Good morning, Chen said warmly, addressing Sarah directly. How are you feeling today? Sarah mumbled a response, her eyes darting nervously to her parents. Chen made a mental note of the dynamic, his instincts on high alert. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, he said, turning to the parents, I need to perform a thorough examination. Would you mind stepping out for a few minutes? The father bristled visibly. Anything you need to do, you can do with us here. We're not leaving our daughter. Chen maintained his calm demeanor, but inwardly, he felt a familiar anger stirring, the same protective instinct that had driven him throughout his mother's case. I understand your concern, he said firmly, but it's standard procedure to give patients privacy during examinations, especially for minors. It allows for more open communication. After a tense moment, the parents reluctantly agreed to wait outside. As soon as the door closed behind them, Chen saw Sarah's posture change, some of the tension leaving her body. Sarah, Chen said gently, pulling up a chair beside her bed, I want you to know that you're safe here. Whatever you tell me stays between us unless you're in immediate danger. Do you understand? The girl nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. Over the next hour, through gentle questioning and patience, Chen uncovered a harrowing story of abuse. Sarah's father had been physically and emotionally abusive for years, and her mother had turned a blind eye, prioritizing the family's reputation over her daughter's safety. As Sarah finished speaking, Chen felt a mixture of sadness and determination. Sarah, you've been incredibly brave in sharing this. What's happening to you is not okay, and it's not your fault. We're going to get you the help you need. Chen left the room with a heavy heart but a clear plan of action. He immediately contacted social services and the hospital's legal team. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity, meetings with Child Protective Services, discussions with hospital administration, and a tense confrontation with Sarah's parents. As Chen explained the situation to the parents, he saw the same mix of denial and anger he'd witnessed in Hawthorne during the trial. The father became belligerent, threatening lawsuits and ruin. In that moment, Chen thought of his mother, of her courage in standing up to injustice, no matter the personal cost. He stood his ground, his voice steady as he addressed the angry man before him. Mr. Thompson, I understand you're upset. But my primary concern is Sarah's well-being. The evidence of abuse is clear, and we have a legal and ethical obligation to report it. You can threaten me all you want, but it won't change the facts. As security escorted the protesting parents from the hospital, Chen felt a mix of emotions. There was satisfaction in knowing he'd taken action to protect a vulnerable patient, but also a deep sadness for the pain Sarah had endured. Later that evening, as Chen was finishing up his paperwork drive, Martinez stopped by his office. I heard about the Sarah Thompson case, she said, a note of pride in her voice. You handled it beautifully, Mike. Not every doctor would have picked up on the signs or had the courage to confront the parents like that. Chen nodded, feeling a combination of exhaustion and resolve. I couldn't ignore it, Emily. Not after everything that's happened. I kept thinking about my mom, about how she always stood up for what was right, no matter the consequences. Emily smiled softly. Your mother's strength lives on in you, Mike. But it's not just her influence I see. You've grown so much through your own experiences. You're connecting with patients on a deeper level, seeing beyond just their physical symptoms. As they talked, Chen realized how much his perspective had shifted since the trial. He was no longer solely focused on his own pain and quest for justice. Instead, he found himself more attuned to the suffering of others, more determined to use his position as a doctor to make a real difference in people's lives. Over the next few weeks, Chen threw himself into advocating for better systems to identify and support victims of abuse within the hospital. He worked closely with social services, helped develop new training programs for staff, and even began speaking at medical conferences about the importance of holistic patient care that addressed not just physical health but emotional and social well-being. One evening, as Chen was leaving the hospital after a long shift, he ran into Detective Taylor in the parking lot. "Mike," Taylor called out, a grin on his face. "I was just coming to find you. Got some news I thought you'd want to hear in person." Chen felt a flutter of anticipation. "What is it, Rob?" "Hawthorne's starting to talk," Taylor said, his voice low but excited. "With the sentencing coming up, he's trying to cut a deal. He's offering information on other corrupt officials, business leaders involved in his schemes." "It's big, Mike, really big." Chen absorbed the news, feeling a complex mix of emotions. Part of him was glad to know that Hawthorne's downfall might lead to more widespread justice. But another part felt a strange sense of detachment. The man who had loomed so large in his life for so long was now just another criminal trying to save his own skin. "That's great news, Rob," Chen said sincerely. "I hope it helps clean up the city. But I think I'm ready to step back from all of that. My focus needs to be here, on my patients." Taylor studied him for a moment, then nodded in understanding. "You've been through a lot, Mike. And from what I hear, you're doing amazing work here. Your mom would be proud." As Taylor drove away, Chen stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking up at the hospital building. He thought about Sarah, about all the other patients who needed not just medical care but true advocacy and support. He thought about his mother, about the values she had instilled in him and the courage she had shown in standing up to corruption. And he thought about his own journey, the pain, the anger, the near destruction, and ultimately, the healing and growth. In that moment, Dr. Michael Chen felt a sense of clarity and purpose stronger than anything he'd experienced before. He couldn't change the past or bring his mother back, but he could honor her memory by continuing to fight for justice and healing in his own way, one patient at a time. As he walked back towards the hospital, ready to check on Sarah one last time before heading home, Chen felt a sense of peace settle over him. The road ahead would undoubtedly hold new challenges and difficult cases, but he was ready to face them, armed with the strength of his experiences and the enduring legacy of his mother's courage. The hospital doors slid open, welcoming him back into the world where he could make a real difference. Dr. Michael Chen stepped through, ready to continue his work, not just as a healer of bodies, but as an advocate for justice and a beacon of hope for those who needed it most. As the weeks turned into months, Dr. Michael Chen found himself settling into a new rhythm. His work at the hospital had taken on a deeper meaning, infused with the lessons he'd learned through his personal struggles and his mother's legacy. He'd become known not just for his surgical skills, but for his compassionate approach to patient care and his advocacy for those who couldn't speak for themselves. One crisp autumn morning, Chen arrived at the hospital to find an unexpected visitor waiting for him. Maria, the elderly woman from the community center who had shared stories about his mother, sat in the waiting area, her face etched with worry. "Dr. Chen," she said, grasping his hand as he approached. "I'm sorry to bother you at work, but I didn't know where else to turn." Chen led her to a quiet corner, his brow furrowed with concern. "What's wrong, Maria? Are you feeling unwell?" She shook her head, her eyes brimming with tears. "It's my grandson, Carlos. He's gotten mixed up with some bad people. I'm afraid he might end up like those young men your mother tried to help years ago." As Maria explained further, Chen felt a familiar stirring in his chest, the same drive to help that had characterized his mother's actions. Carlos, it seemed, had fallen in with a gang that was terrorizing the neighborhood, the same area where Chen's mother had once stood up to local thugs. "I understand your concern, Maria," Chen said softly, his mind already racing with possibilities. "I'm not sure what I can do, but I promise I'll try to help." Over the next few days, Chen found himself diving back into the world he thought he'd left behind after Hawthorne's trial. He reached out to Detective Taylor, seeking information about the gang activity in his old neighborhood. He spoke with social workers and community leaders, trying to understand the factors driving young people like Carlos into these dangerous groups. As he delved deeper, Chen began to see parallels between the current situation and the corruption his mother had fought against years ago. The gang was just a symptom of larger systemic issues, poverty, lack of opportunities, and lingering corruption in local government that allowed such groups to flourish. One evening, as Chen was poring over reports Taylor had shared with him, Martinez knocked on his office door. "Burning the midnight oil again, Mike?" she asked, a hint of concern in her voice. Chen looked up, suddenly aware of how late it had gotten. "Emily," I'm sorry. I guess I lost track of time. She sat down across from him, eyeing the scattered papers on his desk. This isn't about a patient, is it? Mike, are you getting involved in something dangerous? He hesitated, then decided to be honest with his mentor. As he explained the situation with Carlos and the larger issues at play, he saw a mix of emotions cross Emily's face: concern, pride, and something that looked like resignation. You really are your mother's son, aren't you? She said softly when he finished. Mike, I admire what you're trying to do, but please be careful. You've come so far in your healing. I'd hate to see you put yourself at risk. Chen nodded, appreciating her concern. I understand, Emily, but I can't just ignore this. Not when I might be able to make a difference. Over the next few weeks, Chen found himself balancing his hospital duties with his growing involvement in the community. He organized health clinics in the neighborhood, using them as an opportunity to connect with local youth and offer alternatives to gang life. He worked with Taylor to set up a task force that focused on addressing the root causes of gang activity rather than just making arrests. It was during one of these community events that Chen finally met Carlos. The young man was sullen and defensive at first, but as Chen shared stories about his own mother and her work in the neighborhood, he saw a spark of interest in Carlos's eyes. Your mom, Carlos said hesitantly, she really stood up to those guys? Weren't she scared? Chen smiled, remembering Maria's stories. I'm sure she was. But she knew that sometimes you have to be brave to make things better. She believed in this community, in the people here. Just like I do. As they continued to talk, Chen began to see the scared, uncertain young man behind Carlos's tough exterior. He saw a reflection of himself, someone struggling to find his place in the world, looking for purpose and belonging. Over time, with patience and persistent effort, Chen began to make headway. Carlos started volunteering at the community center, slowly distancing himself from his gang connections. Other young people in the neighborhood, inspired by Carlos's change, began to seek out alternatives to gang life. But Chen's efforts didn't go unnoticed by those who profited from the neighborhood's struggles. One night, as he was leaving a late community meeting, he found himself confronted by a group of menacing men. You're causing problems, Doc, one of them growled, stepping closer. Sticking your nose where it don't belong. Just like your mama did. Chen felt his heart race, but he stood his ground, channeling the courage he'd seen in his mother and in himself during Hawthorne's trial. I'm not looking for trouble, he said calmly. I'm just trying to help people in this community. The same community my mother loved. The tension was palpable, and for a moment, Chen thought the situation might turn violent. But then, unexpectedly, a voice called out from the darkness. Leave him alone. Carlos emerged from the shadows, followed by a group of other young people from the neighborhood. Doctor, Chen's here to help us. Anyone who's got a problem with him has a problem with all of us. The would-be attackers, outnumbered and facing unexpected resistance, backed down. As they slunk away, Chen felt a surge of emotion. Pride in Carlos's bravery, gratitude for the community's support, and a profound sense of connection to his mother's legacy. In the days that followed, news of the confrontation spread through the neighborhood. Instead of scaring people away, it seemed to galvanize the community. More residents began attending meetings, volunteering for programs, and speaking out against the gang activity that had plagued their streets for so long. Chen found himself at the center of a growing movement, one that combined his medical expertise with grassroots community organizing. He helped establish a youth mentorship program at the hospital, giving local teenagers exposure to healthcare careers. He worked with city officials to secure funding for after-school programs and job training initiatives. As the months passed, Chen began to see real change in the neighborhood. Crime rates dropped, community engagement increased, and there was a palpable sense of hope in the air. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges and setbacks, but it was progress. One sunny afternoon, almost a year after Maria had first come to him for help, Chen stood in the community center, watching as Carlos led a group of younger kids in a science experiment. The young man's transformation was remarkable. Gone was the angry, lost teenager, replaced by a confident, purposeful young adult with plans to study nursing. Your mother would be so proud, Maria said softly, appearing at Chen's side. She always believed this neighborhood could be something special. And now, thanks to you, it's happening. Chen felt a lump form in his throat. I couldn't have done it without the community, Maria. Without people like you who never gave up hope. As he looked around the bustling community center, at the faces of people he'd come to know and care for, Chen felt a profound sense of belonging. This place, these people, they were a part of him now, connected by more than just shared geography. They were bound by a common purpose, a shared vision of what their community could be. In that moment, Michael Chen realized that he had found something he didn't even know he was looking for, a way to heal not just individual patients, but an entire community. A way to honor his mother's memory not just through remembrance, but through action. As he joined Carlos and the kids in their experiment, laughing at their excitement over a foaming chemical reaction, Chen felt a sense of peace wash over him. The pain of his past would always be a part of him, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it had become a source of strength, driving him to create positive change in the world. Dr. Michael Chen, son of Linda Chen, had found his true calling, not just as a healer of bodies, but as a healer of communities, a builder of bridges, and a bearer of hope. And in doing so, he had ensured that his mother's legacy of courage and compassion would live on, touching lives for generations to come. As the community continued to flourish under the collective efforts of its residents, Dr. Michael Chen found himself at a crossroads. His work at the hospital remained fulfilling, but his involvement in the neighborhood had opened his eyes to broader issues of public health and social justice. He began to wonder if there was a way to merge these two aspects of his life more formally. One crisp morning, as Chen was reviewing patient files in his office, he received an unexpected visit from Dr. Emily Martinez. "Mike," she said, a mixture of excitement and hesitation in her voice, "I have a proposition for you. But before I share it, I want you to know that I'll support whatever decision you make." Intrigued, Chen set aside his work and gave her his full attention. "What's on your mind, Emily?" She took a deep breath before continuing. "The board is considering establishing a new community health and outreach division. It would focus on preventative care, health education, and addressing social determinants of health in underserved areas. They want you to lead it." Chen felt a surge of excitement at the prospect, followed quickly by uncertainty. "Me? But I'm a surgeon, not an administrator." Emily smiled warmly. "You're so much more than just a surgeon, Mike. What you've accomplished in your mother's old neighborhood, it's exactly the kind of work this new division would be doing, but on a larger scale. Your unique combination of medical expertise and community engagement makes you the perfect candidate." As Chen considered the offer, his mind raced with possibilities. He thought of Carlos and the other young people he'd mentored, of the health clinics he'd organized, of the systemic issues he'd begun to understand more deeply through his work in the community. It would mean stepping back from surgery, he mused aloud, more to himself than to Emily. She nodded understandingly. "It would. And I know how much your surgical work means to you. That's why this has to be entirely your decision, Mike. Take some time to think about it." Over the next few weeks, Chen found himself grappling with the choice before him. He sought advice from colleagues, discussed the opportunity with community leaders, and spent long hours in reflection. One evening, as he was volunteering at the community center, he overheard a conversation that would ultimately tip the scales. A group of teenagers, including Carlos, were discussing their future plans. "I never thought I'd be considering a career in healthcare," one young woman said. "But seeing Chen and how he's helped our neighborhood, it makes me want to do the same." Carlos nodded enthusiastically. "Yeah, he's shown us that being a doctor isn't just about treating sick people in a hospital. It's about making whole communities healthier." Listening to their words, Chen felt a powerful sense of clarity wash over him. He realized that while he could help individuals as a surgeon, leading this new division would allow him to effect change on a much broader scale. He could help shape policies, implement programs, and inspire a new generation of healthcare professionals who understood the importance of community engagement. The next day, Chen scheduled a meeting with Dr. Martinez to accept the position. As he shared his decision with her, he felt a mix of excitement and nervous anticipation. "I'm thrilled, Mike," Emily said, beaming with pride. "I know this wasn't an easy decision, but I truly believe you're going to do amazing things in this role." As Chen began the transition into his new position, he found himself facing a steep learning curve. There were budgets to manage, policies to develop, and partnerships to forge. But he approached each challenge with the same determination and compassion that had characterized his work as a surgeon and community advocate. One of his first initiatives was to establish a mentorship program that paired medical students with community health workers. The program aimed to give future doctors a deeper understanding of the social and economic factors that influence health outcomes. Chen also worked to expand the hospital's telehealth services, making it easier for patients in underserved areas to access specialist care. He collaborated with local schools to implement comprehensive health education programs, focusing not just on physical health but also on mental wellness and substance abuse prevention. As the months passed, Chen's innovative approaches began to yield tangible results. Emergency room visits for preventable conditions decreased. More community members were accessing primary care services. And perhaps most significantly, there was a growing sense of trust between the hospital and the communities it served. However, the path wasn't always smooth. Chen faced resistance from some members of the hospital administration who were skeptical of the resources being allocated to community outreach. There were also challenges in navigating the complex bureaucracies of local government and securing sustainable funding for long-term programs. During one particularly frustrating week, when a promising partnership with a local nonprofit fell through due to political maneuvering, Chen found himself questioning his decision to take on this new role. He missed the immediate gratification of surgical work, the clear-cut nature of mending a broken body. Seeking solace, he visited his mother's grave for the first time in months. As he stood there, surrounded by the quiet stillness of the cemetery, he found himself speaking aloud. "Mom," he said softly, "I hope I'm doing the right thing. Sometimes it feels like for every step forward, we take 2 steps back. I wonder if I'm really making a difference." As if in answer, a gentle breeze rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sounds of children playing in a nearby park. Chen closed his eyes, listening. In that moment, he was reminded of why he had taken on this challenge in the first place: for those children, for their families, for the countless individuals whose lives could be improved through better health and stronger communities. Reinvigorated, Chen threw himself back into his work with renewed passion. He redoubled his efforts to build coalitions, to find creative solutions to entrenched problems, and to inspire others to join in the mission of community health. His persistence began to pay off. The mentorship program he had established started producing its first graduates, young doctors with a deep commitment to community-based care. The telehealth initiative expanded, connecting rural clinics with specialist care that was previously out of reach. And slowly but surely, health outcomes in the target communities began to improve. One day, about a year into his new role, Chen received a visitor in his office, Detective Robert Taylor, now nearing retirement. "Mike," Taylor said warmly, shaking his hand, "I heard about all the good work you've been doing. I wanted to come see for myself." As Chen gave him a tour of the new community health facilities and introduced him to some of the program participants, he saw a look of wonder grow on Taylor's face. "You know," Taylor said as they finished the tour, "when we were working on your mom's case, I never imagined this is where it would lead. You've taken something tragic and turned it into something beautiful." Chen felt a lump form in his throat at Taylor's words. "I couldn't have done it without you, Rob. Without everyone who helped bring the truth to light." Taylor nodded, his eyes misty. "Your mom would be proud, Mike." "Hell, I'm proud. You're changing lives here." As Taylor left, Chen stood for a moment in the bustling lobby of the community health center. He watched as patients checked in for appointments, as community health workers led education sessions, as medical students engaged in earnest discussions about social determinants of health. In that moment, Dr. Michael Chen felt the full weight of his journey, from the traumatized son seeking justice, to the dedicated surgeon, to his current role as a catalyst for community health and social change. He realized that each step, each challenge, had led him to this place where he could honor his mother's memory in the most meaningful way possible, by carrying forward her spirit of courage, compassion, and commitment to justice. As he turned to head back to his office, ready to tackle the next challenge, Chen felt a deep sense of purpose and belonging. He knew that the road ahead would not always be easy, that there would be setbacks and frustrations. But he also knew that he was exactly where he needed to be, doing the work that needed to be done. Dr. Michael Chen, son of Linda Chen, surgeon, community advocate, and now leader in community health, had found his true calling. And in doing so, he had ensured that his mother's legacy would continue to touch lives and transform communities for generations to come. As Dr. Michael Chen's Community Health and Outreach Division continued to grow and make significant impacts. Word of its success began to spread beyond the confines of the city. Public health officials from other regions started reaching out, eager to learn from and potentially replicate the model Chen had developed. One crisp autumn morning, Chen received an unexpected call from the office of the State Health Commissioner. They were putting together a task force to address healthcare disparities across the state, and they wanted Chen to be a key advisor. As he considered the offer, Chen felt a mix of excitement and trepidation. This was an opportunity to expand the reach of his work, to potentially influence policy at a state level. But it would also mean less time on the ground in the communities he'd grown to love, less direct interaction with the people he was trying to help. Seeking guidance, Chen decided to consult with those who had been instrumental in his journey. He organized a small gathering at the community center, inviting Drive, Martinez, Detective Taylor, Maria, Carlos, and a few other key figures from the neighborhood. As they sat around a table, sharing a meal prepared by some of the center's youth program participants, Chen laid out the situation and asked for their thoughts. Maria was the first to speak, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Dr. Chen, when you first started working in this neighborhood, I hoped you might be able to help my Carlos. I never imagined you would transform our entire community. If you can do that for other places too, I think you have to try." Carlos nodded in agreement. "Yeah, Doc, think about all the other kids out there like I was. They need someone to believe in them, to show them there's another way. You can help make that happen, Doctor." Martinez leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "Mike, when I first suggested you for the Community Health Division, I knew you had potential. But what you've accomplished here, it's beyond anything I could have imagined. This task force could be a chance to create real, systemic change." Detective Taylor, now retired but still deeply invested in the community, added his perspective. "You've got a gift, Mike. Not just for medicine, but for bringing people together, for seeing the big picture. The state needs that kind of vision." Chen listened to each of them, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for their support and wisdom. But there was still a part of him that hesitated, that worried about losing touch with the grassroots work that had become so important to him. As if reading his mind, Drive, Martinez spoke again. "Mike, taking on this advisory role doesn't mean abandoning what you've built here. In fact, it's an opportunity to ensure that the principles you've established, community engagement, holistic health approaches, addressing social determinants, become integral parts of statewide health policy." Chen nodded slowly, the path forward becoming clearer in his mind. "You're right, and maybe this is a chance to create a model that can be replicated in other communities, to train others to do this kind of work." The group continued to discuss the possibilities late into the evening, brainstorming ideas for how Chen could balance his new responsibilities with his ongoing commitment to the local community. By the time they parted ways, Chen felt a renewed sense of purpose and excitement about the challenge ahead. The next morning, Chen called the State Health Commissioner's office to accept the position on the task force. However, he made it clear that he would need to maintain his role at the hospital and his involvement in the local community health initiatives. To his relief, the commissioner was not only agreeable but enthusiastic about this arrangement, seeing it as a way to keep the task force grounded in real-world experiences. Over the next few months, Chen found himself shuttling between his local work and state-level meetings. It was a grueling schedule, but he found the work invigorating. He was able to bring the lessons learned from his community health initiatives to the state level, advocating for policies that would support similar programs across the state. At the same time, he worked to create a leadership structure within his community health division that would allow the work to continue and thrive even when he couldn't be there day to day. He was particularly proud to see Carlos step into a leadership role, coordinating youth outreach programs and serving as a powerful example of the transformative potential of community-based healthcare. As Chen's influence grew, he began to receive invitations to speak at national conferences and contribute to public health journals. His unique approach, combining clinical expertise with community engagement and a focus on social determinants of health, was gaining attention in the wider medical community. One evening, as Chen was preparing notes for an upcoming keynote speech at a national public health conference, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about his mother, about the pain of her loss and the long struggle for justice. He thought about Thompson's deathbed confession, about Hawthorne's trial, about the moments when he had nearly lost himself to anger and vengeance. But mostly, he thought about the unexpected path of healing he had found, not just for himself, but for entire communities. He realized that in working to address the systemic issues that contributed to poor health outcomes, he was also addressing the root causes of many of the social ills that had allowed corruption like Hawthorne's to flourish. As he sat at his desk, surrounded by research papers and policy briefs, Chen's eyes fell on a framed photograph of his mother. It had been taken at a community event years ago, and she was smiling broadly, surrounded by neighborhood children. Looking at her face, Chen felt a profound sense of connection and purpose. "I hope I'm making you proud, Mom," he whispered to the photograph. "I'm trying to carry on your work, in my own way." Just then, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Carlos. "Hey Doc, just wanted to let you know. Remember that kid I was worried about, the one who reminded me of myself? He just signed up for the Youth Health Ambassador program. Your mom's legacy lives on." Chen felt his eyes well up with tears as he read the message. This, he realized, was the true measure of his work, not the accolades or the policy changes, important as they were, but the individual lives touched, the ripple effects of positive change spreading through communities. As he turned back to his speech preparation, Chen felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that the road ahead would continue to be challenging. There would be political obstacles, funding battles, and the ever-present inertia of entrenched systems resistant to change. But he also knew that he wasn't alone in this fight. He had a growing network of allies, from community members to state officials, from medical students he had mentored to public health experts across the country. In his mind, Chen began to envision the next phase of his work. He saw opportunities to create partnerships between medical schools and community organizations, ensuring that the next generation of doctors would understand the importance of community engagement and social determinants of health. He imagined pilot programs that could test innovative approaches to healthcare delivery in underserved areas, generating data that could inform policy at the state and national levels. But even as he thought about these larger initiatives, Chen remained committed to staying connected to the grassroots work that had started him on this path. He made a mental note to schedule more time at the community center, to ensure he never lost touch with the real people and real lives at the heart of his mission. As the night grew late, Chen finally set aside his work and prepared to head home. Before leaving his office, he took one last look at the photograph of his mother. In that moment, he felt a deep sense of peace and rightness. He knew that while the pain of her loss would always be with him, he had found a way to transform that pain into purpose, to carry forward her legacy of compassion and justice in a way that was uniquely his own. Dr. Michael Chen, son of Linda Chen, walked out of his office and into the quiet hospital corridors. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. And he was ready to face them all, carrying with him the strength of his past, the support of his community, and the hope for a healthier, more just future for all. As Dr. Michael Chen's work continued to gain recognition and influence, he found himself at the forefront of a growing movement in public health. His approach, which emphasized the interconnectedness of community well-being, social justice, and healthcare outcomes, was beginning to reshape conversations at both local and national levels. 5 years after joining the state task force, Chen received an invitation that would mark another turning point in his career. The World Health Organization was organizing a global conference on health equity and community-based healthcare models, and they wanted Chen to be a keynote speaker. As he prepared for this international platform, Chen reflected on how far he had come from the angry, grief-stricken young man who had once been consumed by the quest for personal vengeance. He thought about the countless lives touched by the programs he had helped implement, the policies he had influenced, and the new generation of healthcare professionals he had inspired. The night before his departure for Geneva, Chen made a pilgrimage to his mother's grave. As he stood there in the quiet cemetery, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and purpose. "Mom," he said softly, "I'm about to share our story with the world. Not just the tragedy of what happened to you, but the hope and healing that has grown from it. I want you to know that your courage, your commitment to justice and community, it lives on. It's touched more lives than I can count." As he spoke, Chen felt a warm breeze ruffle his hair, almost like a gentle caress. He smiled, feeling his mother's presence in that moment, a source of strength and inspiration as he prepared to take on this new challenge. The WHO conference was unlike anything Chen had experienced before. He found himself surrounded by health experts, policymakers, and community leaders from around the globe, all united in their commitment to improving health outcomes for underserved populations. As Chen took the stage for his keynote address, he looked out at the diverse audience and felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was not just representing himself or his hospital, but carrying the stories and hopes of countless individuals from his community and beyond. Distinguished colleagues, he began, his voice steady and clear, I stand before you today not just as a doctor, but as the son of a woman whose courage and sacrifice set me on the path that led me here. My mother, Linda Chen, was murdered for standing up against corruption in our community. For years, I was consumed by grief and the desire for vengeance. But through a series of events that I can only describe as transformative, I discovered a different way to honor her memory and to heal, not just myself, but entire communities. As Chen shared his journey, from the night of Thompson's confession to the establishment of the Community Health Division, from local initiatives to state-level policy changes, he could see his words resonating with the audience. Heads nodded in understanding, eyes shone with recognition of shared challenges and hopes. What we've discovered, Chen continued, is that true health equity cannot be achieved in isolation. It requires us to address the social determinants of health, poverty, education, housing, environmental factors. It demands that we engage with communities not as outsiders bringing solutions, but as partners in creating sustainable change. He went on to outline the key principles of the model he had developed: community engagement at every level of healthcare planning and delivery, integration of social services with medical care, training healthcare professionals to understand and address social determinants of health, and using data to drive continual improvement and policy advocacy. As Chen concluded his speech, the room erupted in applause. But more importantly, he could see the spark of inspiration in the eyes of many attendees, the beginnings of new ideas, new collaborations, new possibilities for change. In the days that followed, Chen found himself engaged in deep discussions with health ministers, NGO leaders, and fellow physicians from around the world. He was humbled to learn how his work had already influenced programs in other countries, and excited by the potential for global collaboration. One conversation, in particular, stood out. A health official from a developing nation approached Chen with tears in her eyes. "Dr. Chen," she said, grasping his hand, "your mother's story, your story. It reminds me of my own country's struggles. But you've shown us a path forward, a way to turn pain into progress. Thank you." As the conference drew to a close, Chen found himself filled with a sense of both accomplishment and anticipation. He had come to share his experiences, but he was leaving with new insights, new connections, and a broader vision for the future of his work. On the flight back home, Chen began to sketch out ideas for the next phase of his journey. He envisioned an international network of community health initiatives, sharing best practices and supporting each other in advocating for policy changes. He thought about ways to leverage technology to bring specialized care to remote areas, and how to create training programs that would embed the principles of community engagement and social determinants of health into medical education worldwide. As the plane descended towards his home city, Chen looked out the window at the familiar skyline. He thought about how much had changed since that night when Thompson had confessed to his mother's murder. The city had transformed, not just through physical development, but through the strengthening of communities, the breaking down of barriers, and the growth of a more equitable healthcare system. Chen's first stop after landing was not his home or the hospital, but the community center where so much of his work had begun. As he walked through the doors, he was greeted by the sight of Carlos leading a group of teenagers in a health education session. "Dr. Chen," Carlos exclaimed, his face lighting up. "We didn't expect you back so soon. How was Geneva?" Chen smiled, taking in the scene before him. The engaged young faces, the walls covered with health information posters, the sense of purpose and community that filled the room. "It was incredible, Carlos. But you know what? Coming back here, seeing all of this, it reminds me why we do what we do. This is where real change happens, one person, one community at a time." As Chen joined the group, listening to the teenagers share their ideas for improving health in their neighborhood, he felt a deep sense of coming full circle. From the depths of personal tragedy, he had found a way to create ripples of positive change that were now spreading across the globe. Yet, he remained grounded in the community where it all began, committed to the grassroots work that formed the foundation of his approach. Later that evening, as Chen sat in his office reviewing emails and messages that had accumulated during his trip, he came across a news alert that made his heart skip a beat. Richard Hawthorne, the man responsible for his mother's death, had died in prison. For a moment, Chen sat in stunned silence, a whirlwind of emotions washing over him. There was a time when this news would have consumed him, when he might have felt a bitter satisfaction. But now, he found himself reflecting on the journey that Hawthorne's actions had inadvertently set him upon. Chen thought about all the lives that had been touched, all the positive changes that had occurred in the years since he had chosen healing over vengeance. He realized that while Hawthorne's crime had caused immeasurable pain, it had also, in a strange way, been the catalyst for a movement that was now improving lives around the world. In that moment, Dr. Michael Chen made a decision. He would use this news not as a reason to dwell on the past, but as motivation to push even harder for the changes he wanted to see in the world. He began drafting an op-ed, not about Hawthorne's death, but about the transformative power of choosing compassion over revenge, of channeling pain into purpose. As he wrote, Chen felt a sense of release, as if the last lingering shadows of his old anger and grief were finally lifting. He was no longer defined by what had happened to his mother, but by what he had chosen to do in response to it. The next morning, as Chen walked into the hospital to start another day of work, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He knew that there were still many challenges ahead, health disparities to address, systems to change, minds to open. But he also knew that he was not alone in this fight. He carried with him the strength of his mother's memory, the support of his community, and now, a global network of allies committed to creating a more just and healthy world. Dr. Michael Chen, son of Linda Chen, surgeon, community health advocate, and now international leader in health equity, stepped into the bustling hospital lobby. He was ready to continue the work of healing, not just bodies, but communities and systems. As he greeted colleagues and patients, his mother's spirit lived on in every compassionate gesture, every life touched, every positive change made. And so, the legacy of Linda Chen continued to grow and evolve, reaching far beyond the confines of the neighborhood she had once sought to protect. Through her son, and through the countless individuals inspired by their story, her courage and commitment to justice had become a catalyst for global change, a testament to the enduring power of love, compassion, and the unwavering pursuit of a better world for all. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings.